Welcome to the Robert E. Howard in 1935 panel. I'm Bobby Derie. You might have seen me on some other panels. I'm the author of Weird Tailors, Essays on Robert E. Howard and Others. This is Will Oliver, who just published a biography of Robert E. Howard.
If you haven't seen it. Well, is that for dramatic effect?
Right.
We don't want to see the book.
I'm John Bollard. I had the unfortunate duty to be the person that's in charge of the ultimate editions of the collected letters of Robert E. Howard. That's a never-ending job. And I'm also on the board of directors. So, we get the lights on. Some of us are blind. Thank you. Okay. Fortunately, we had a PowerPoint presentation ready to go and can't work it. So we're going to start off. Our talk is on Robert E. Howard in the year 1935. We're going to cover what happened to him personally and professionally. And we're going to try and go from the beginning to the end. So anything you guys want to say about 1934, how that ended off?
In the beginning, so 1934 compared to 35 was actually a pretty good year for Howard. He was making some decent money. He was publishing. Was dating Novelin. Things were looking pretty good. And what I would say with his mother, even though she was having a lot of problems with her health, there was still that sense of hope. Like if we just get her to the right doctor, we just get her to the right sanitarium, and she gets treated, she'll be fine and everything will be better. That changes in 1935. But so 34 was looking good, and almost from the beginning, 35 was a good year and a bad year. It was just a rocky year, but it also was kind of the beginning of the end.
And you have to remember that this was around the part of time where Weird Tales was starting to fall behind in payments, and he would be getting half checks for some stories because the bank that Weird Tales used had failed and did not reopen. And so they were trying to rebuild their capital fund and get all their people paid, and they had a very small staff, but the printer, they owed all the money to the printer, and the printer had to be paid off first, and then the authors when they could get to them. So Robert E. Howard was growing in popularity, especially with Conan being a successful series at this point. It had been running for over 2 years, heading into 1935, and it was looking good to continue running as far as he could continue pumping him out. Farnsworth Wright was picking him up almost as soon as he was sending him in. But there was that slowdown in payments.
The second thing that was going great for him was he had started writing his Breckinridge Elkins character, and that had really taken off. The pulp action stories was buying every Breckinridge Elkins story he could sell or write. And he went on, they started publishing every issue they put out, had a Breckinridge Elkins story in it from 1934 till after his death, in, I think it's September 1936. So he was also starting to try and break into other types of writing genres, such as adventures. He had started to sell some of his El Borak stories to one of the pulps. So things were starting to look up for him financially at the start of 1935. January 1935, he took his Conan novel, The Hour of the Dragon, and they had tried to sell it. He wrote it specifically for a British publisher. The British publisher went into bankruptcy, and they sent him the story back. So at that point, he took the story and sent it in to Farnsworth Wright at Weird Tales, and Farnsworth bought it in January, but it would not start to be published till December of 1935. So he had to wait to start getting any sort of payment for that in December of 1935.
Part of splashing all those different markets was that in 1934, he had taken Otis Adelbert Klein as his agent. So while Howard was still selling directly to Weird Tales, because that was a market he had built up himself, Klein was encouraging him to try other things. Give me a detective story, give me a mystery story, give me a boxing story, and he tried to sell it. And sometimes he did, and sometimes he didn't. But that's how in 1935 he started to try to splash the spices.
And then one of the benefits to that is that by having a literary agent, they do all the legwork. Whereas before, Howard wrote them, would send them out. If they got rejected, he'd have to then, redo it, write a new letter, send it out, and he had to do, and this took up a lot of time. So now all of a sudden with a literary agent, he's got more time to write more stories to be able to make more money.
And one of the good things is that because of the relationship he built up with the editor that started buying the Breck Elkins stories, that editor left that pulp and moved over to another pulp. And he asked Howard to specifically write him some Breck Elkins stories. So Howard did not want to do that. He wanted to keep selling the stories to that particular pulp, but he started to create some knockoff characters of Breckenridge Elkins too, which became series characters in 1936 at the time of his death. And that's Buckner J. Grimes and Pike Bearfield. The other one that basically it was a Breckenridge Elkins story that did not sell, called an Elkins Never Surrenders. So here you wrote the story changing the character to is it Bearfield Elston? Yeah. And it changed the title to An Elston Never Surrenders. And he kind of changed it a little bit when he rewrote it, because if you compare it to the Elkins story, the Elston story is like a Bugs Bunny cartoon turned up to 25 in terms of psychotic attack and action, whereas Elkins is more of a reactive character to what's going on. One of the other things is that starting in February, his mother, Hester, who's the woman on the left, that's her sister Coralie on the right, her health started failing. And so in February, they had to take her to, I think it was Temple, to get a gallbladder surgery. And she had a very bad recovery from the gallbladder surgery. She was in the hospital for about a month. And then once they got her back home, he had to start taking her over to Coleman, to a hospital in Coleman, to get her wound taken care of several times a week. So for about 2.5 months, he was unable to really do any writing because of caring for his mother. Plus he was also spending money as the main breadwinner in the family because Dr. Howard was getting paid as a country doctor in kind, like chickens, eggs, pork and whatnot. So Bob was the main one who had money, and so he was having to pay the medical bills for his mother.
Gallbladder surgery was not uncommon during the period, but it had a high after-surgery fatality because of infections. H.P. Lovecraft's mother died of infection after having her gallbladder removed in 1921. And when Lovecraft's wife went in for gallbladder surgery, he strongly encouraged her to do anything else. So people knew that this could kill you back then. And she had moments where she looked like she was getting better. Novelyn Price once wrote that she had that encounter with Dr. Howard when they'd just gotten back from Temple and they'd had the abscess treated, and Hester Howard seemed to be improving. And Dr. Howard, knew it was not going to be a permanent improvement, but he let Bob believe otherwise. He actually said in a letter, as the months grew on, his mother showed some improvement. He accepted her conditions as one of permanent improvement, and that would continue. I knew well that it would not, but I kept it from him. And this is part of why in 1936, her really sudden downturn of health might have caught him. Maybe.
So now he's spending all of this money on the doctor's visit, which again, he needs the cash to be able to spend this because doctors won't accept, the regular doctors, not the country doctors, won't accept chickens and, and milk and what have you. So this is where, because of the fact that Weird Tales was not sending him money, he needed the cash. And so he had to do something that had to have been, well, it was very unlike Howard, for starters, and it had to have been very difficult for him, but to basically send a plea letter to Farnsworth Wright to try to get some money to be able to help his mother out. So in the letter that he wrote May 6, he opens, I always hate to write a letter like this, and it's not like he wrote a lot of these types of letters. This is really unique. For some time now, I've been receiving a check regularly each month from Weird Tales, half checks. It is true, but by practicing the most rigid economy, I have managed to keep my head above water. Somehow, some way, my family and I have struggled along this far. But if you cut off my monthly checks now, I don't know what in God's name we'll do. I don't feel that my request is unreasonable. As you know, it's been 6 months since the people of the Black Circle, the story of the check for which is now due me, appeared in Weird Tales. Weird Tales owes me over $800 for stories already published and supposed to be paid for on publication, enough to pay all my debts and get me back on my feet again if I could receive it all at once. So again, he's having to make this plea, and as Bobby said, Farnsworth Wright is dealing with the banks and the loss of the money, and so Farnsworth Wright is trying to save Weird Tales, which, if you think about it, is going to benefit Howard, but at the same time, Howard's trying to save the life of his mother. It's a little bit different.
Howard was also very active in the fan community this year, because it was in 1935 that he did The Challenge from Beyond, a round robin with H.P. Lovecraft, C.L. Moore, A. Merritt, and Frank Belknap Long that ran in the Fantasy magazine. And it was very funny how it came about, because Lovecraft, the first 2 sections by C.L. Moore and A. Merritt didn't do much with the story. You know, they just sort of laid the groundwork. Then it was up to Lovecraft with the 3rd section to do the actual plot. And he laid out his very typical plot and had a scholarly character encountering some aliens and then being transported to a strange far-off world where, horror of horrors, he ends up in the body of a worm. And Robert E. Howard gets this. So what does he do? Well, being a worm isn't that bad. I'll just kick all the other worms' ass and be king. And that's what he did. And H.P. Lovecraft thought this was the funniest thing in the world. He wrote, Two Gun immediately transformed the scholarly and mild-mannered professor into a raging and sanguinary Conan, while Belknap aired his pet theory concerning man's profound innate savagery. And what it is, Howard and Frank Belknap Long had very different ideas about violence. So when Long followed on from Howard, he followed on the alien stuck in a human's body almost immediately succumbing to nature. So, you know, everybody was true to form, and it's not a great story if you look at it, but if you look at everything that went into it, everybody was being very accurate to themselves. But Howard was being more active in the fanzines, and he started to get more notice in the fanzines. Alvin Earl Perry put forth a biographical sketch of Howard that aired in one of the fanzines, and Frank F. Lee Baldwin tried to write another one, but he was getting his information from Lovecraft, and Perry beat him to the punch. So I just want to read a little bit from a biographical sketch of Robert E. Howard, which ran in the July 1935 issue of Fantasy magazine. Conan, Solomon Kane, King Kull. These names mean action, adventure, romance to thousands of fantasy fans throughout America. They are the heroes of adult fairy tales, rather gory ones, it must be admitted, penned by he who is perhaps the greatest actionist writing fantasy today, Robert E. Howard. This much-read author is a Texan. He was born January 22nd, 1906, in the small village of Peaster, some 45 miles west of Fort Worth, and still resides in the Lone Star State, the further west. And it goes on from there, and this is all information that Howard had supplied to Perry. And it was these early interactions with fandom that helped shape Howard's immediate legacy. When we talk about the probable outline of Conan's career and the publication of the Hyborian Age through the Fantagraph and then the Laney Collective, that all came from Howard's interactions with fandom.
So about May, we have a letter that Howard wrote to HPL explaining what was going on with him and what his writing was going to be. Said, lately I've been trying to break into some new markets specializing on the adventure angle. Top Notch has bought 4 long stories from me, giving me the cover design on the last issue, and I'm trying to make it regularly. And this is the big point coming from Weird Tales and his treatment by Farnsworth Wright. Weird stories offer such a narrow field, and the pay is so low that I may be forced to abandon that style of yarn entirely and devote all my efforts elsewhere, though I'd hate to give up fantasy writing entirely. So from here, you can see he's starting to transition away from fantasy, going for adventure, and also starting to write the Westerns that are paying him. Weird Tales was paying, what, 1/2 cent a word at that time upon publication, not upon acceptance. The other pulps that he was starting to break in, they were usually paying about 1 penny a word upon acceptance and not on publication. And the problem, as you've heard, is that Weird Tales, due to their financial situation, was only sending him a monthly check, giving him half of what he was owed at the time. And even that, they weren't really paying him what he was needed at, or what he was owed at that time. I don't know, do you know if he ever found out about Seabury Quinn always getting paid on time?
Well, Seabury Quinn claimed, all right, so Seabury Quinn was the most popular author at Weird Tales during its initial run, 1923 and 1954. He claimed he was always paid on time. In his letters, he makes it clear he wasn't. But, you know, there's what he claims in public and there's what actually happened. I don't think he got preferential treatment, aside from maybe getting the higher end of Weird Tales' range. Weird Tales went from 1/2 cent a word to 1 cent a word on average. On very rare occasions, they'd go up to 1.5 cents, but that was rare. Like, very few people got that. Even Lovecraft didn't usually get that.
Merritt got it, right?
Yeah, Merritt got it. But this was at a time when Strange Tales of Mystery and Terror came out. They were paying 2 cents a word. So you can see why all the Weird Tales authors were going for Strange Tales. But that was a couple of years in the past, and a bunch of those magazines that Howard had been making failed. You know, Strange Tales of Mystery and Terror went down in 1933, and Fight Stories went down in 34, I think. And, you know, so he would make a market, it would go along, then the Great Depression would kill it, and he'd make another market. And that's how Howard was going. You know, he had to make money, he had to keep writing, he had to keep finding new markets, and that's what Klein was good at for him. And Klein also did some odd stuff. Howard managed to do a collaboration with Chandler H. Whipple called The Last Ride in 1935. Which isn't one of Howard's typical Westerns, but again, he's fixing up a story for somebody else, which was not, I think, his preferred way of doing anything.
But it offered money.
But it offered money.
Going on to June, we have a letter to August Derleth by Howard. I've been working overtime trying to rebuild my bankroll a little, which naturally took a devil of a licking. I've given up trying to write detective yarns. We'll come back to that. A job I despise anyway, and am concentrating on adventure stuff. You might possibly have noticed my novel in the latest Top Notch. So this is his El Borak character that's starting to take off in that.
But there's something wrapped up in this that's important. I've been working overtime trying to rebuild my bankroll. You know, he's having to write. In order to get paid, he has to write, which means he has to write a lot, and he has to send out a lot because he gets rejections. And he has to write more. And if he loses a pulp that he's been writing for, now he's got to start all over and find a new pulp to be able to publish to make money. So he's working an enormous amount. And one of the things I did in the biography was when he was a little bit younger, he was having troubles with just interest in women and interest in kind of anything, kind of this lackadaisical, and so he wanted to go to the doctor, and so Dr. Howard lined him up to go to a specialist, but still, you know, a country city doctor, if you get what I mean. And so he goes there, and the doctor gives him the diagnosis of sexual anesthesia. So that sounds really weird and sexual, and of course, you know, L. Sprague de Camp, sorry Gary, he utilized it to kind of, you know, promote that, you know, he's psychologically got all kinds of problems, and, you know, sexually he's got problems, etc. I ended up reading 2 books on the history of sexual neurasthenia, which is, you know, is really exciting reading, you know, reading this medical. So, but it was an eye-opener, because what I didn't know was that sexual anesthesia was a diagnosis given by the medical science, medical doctors in the late 1800s. And it was this new disease or problem that people were facing, and they were having a hard time of caring about anything or having any kind of sexual interest that was dying on them, and they didn't understand why. The other thing was, among a lot of people diagnosed with this, they ended up committing suicide. So along comes the early 20th century psychology, and psychology starts to take over the diagnosis of sexual anesthesia. So when Howard goes to the doctor and is diagnosed with that, this is really a dated diagnosis among the doctors. It's really been handed over now to the psychologist. And it turns out what sexual anesthesia is chronic fatigue syndrome. That's what we would call it today. So when you work really hard and you spend lots of hours working and you don't get a lot of sleep, you don't eat very well, you're not getting exercise, you're not taking a break away, which Howard wasn't doing because he had to write, he wasn't going on vacation, and he talks about that in a lot of his letters. I wish I could go somewhere, but then you start hearing, I don't really care, I want to go here, but I probably won't. He loses a lot of his interest in life. And again, this is a disease of modern man. We've created this civilization that puts a lot of stress on us. It's a faster world, and he has to produce a lot, so he's working himself to death. And again, it contributes, I think, to the problems that he started to face, was just the chronic fatigue. I mean, he's facing what a lot of people face today.
And this was at the time when he was telling Novel Price that he was working 18 hours a day at the typewriter. And you can imagine what it's like out there now in this heat.
Without air conditioning.
Without air conditioning, pounding the keys on a mechanical typewriter, talking out a story 18 hours a day. Yeah, I can definitely see how he'd get tired. Do we want to talk about the relationship with Novel?
Yes, that's perfect opening. So, backing up to May, the woman he was dating, Novel Price, started dating his best friend, Truett Vincent. And
we should talk about April first.
April? Okay.
Okay. All right. So Novel Price was also very busy. She had returned to Cross Plains for a 1935 school year to teach, and she was doing all sorts of extracurricular activities with the school, with amateur dramaticals, and taking the kids to meet. And in April, she has an incident that sends her to the hospital. The Cross Plains Review called it indigestion. Her own memoir, One Who Walked Alone, is very sketchy about what actually happened. I think Patrice Louinet has some fanciful ideas that maybe she'd had a miscarriage, but there's no proof of what actually had. If you look at what she was doing in 1935 in her book, she was working all the time, she wasn't eating a lot, and then she suddenly collapsed, and they sent her to the hospital, and they asked, "Are you starving yourself?" So you get the idea that both Bob and Novelin were sort of workaholics in their own world. And I think that lack of time with each other affected their relationship. That's my speculation. But then, in May,
her family, she goes down to Brownwood where Truett lives. So they see each other. They kind of knew each other before from
the bookstore
from
and
high school and whatnot.
Yeah.
So he asks her out on a date. They start dating. They suddenly realize, what are we going to do about Bob?
Not tell him.
Yeah. Well, I thought that she said that they did try to tell him, but he just would not want to hear it. He just totally ignored it.
Well, initially she said that, I saw Truett. I saw Truett in Brownwood. That's what she told Howard.
and some of Howard's friends had tried to play little tricks on him before, so he might have had that in his mind. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know because Howard would never talk about that sort of thing in his letters. So we're mostly getting this from Novelin's perspective.
And also raises a little bit of a question to me because when you go back to several years before when his beloved dog Patch started to die, he did not want to deal with that. He left town, went to Brownwood, and would call to check and see what's happening, and would find out what was going on with Patch. When Patch finally died and was buried in the backyard, he called and said, "You can come home." So he came home.
Isn't Patch cute? He's a cute doggy.
He's a cute dog.
So in June, Truett asked Bob, let's go back to New Mexico. They had gone to New Mexico the year before, where they went to Carlsbad Cavern. And from that trip, Bob wrote Jules of Gwaller, the Conan story. So Truett has family up in Santa Fe. So they say, okay, we're going to go on this big trip up to Santa Fe. We're going to go see some sights in Santa Fe, go on into Colorado. And Bob was hoping to go to Arizona. So they leave on June the 19th. He goes down to Brownwood, picks up Truett, cuts over from Brownwood to the Pecos River, goes up the Pecos River, all the way up to Roswell, and they spend the night in Roswell. So on June the 19th, while they were in Roswell, he bought 2 postcards that he sent to Novelin. One of the postcards depicted a Mexican man standing in a yard of giant clay earthen pots, and was talking about the pot makers there. And the writing on the back of the card was, the beer is lousy.
The weather is good, the beer is lousy. I hope you are the same.
Yeah. So she thought this was funny. The second card, more interesting, was a picture of a rattlesnake swallowing a rabbit. And he just wrote Novelin.
Bob.
So you're starting to think, was that him being passive aggressive on the relationship between her and Truett? But we don't know. So the next day, on the 20th, they went on into Lincoln. And Bob loved Billy the Kid. He loved the history of the Lincoln County War. And several of his letters to H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth, he would recount what episode from Billy the Kid's life as it appeared in Walter Noble Burns' book on the life of Billy the Kid and what happened during the Lincoln County War. So they were really looking forward, or he was really looking forward to going to Lincoln to see the town. So, I'll talk, see if I can find that.
And Robert Howard had a great love of the Texas outlaw history tradition. And that's going right up almost until the Great Depression itself and Prohibition with Bonnie and Clyde coming down. He was keen on the idea that these were individualists. These were not people bound by the law, but they were bound by whatever he considered their code of honor, their code of conduct. And this is what he would expound in his letters to H.P. Lovecraft as he's crafting a tale. And you can very much see that in Conan and other characters that are thieves, but they're not dishonorable thieves. It's almost like Raymond Chandler's hard-boiled narcs are, what is a detective? In this story, he is everything. If he is a man of honor in one thing, he is a man of honor in all things. He would not despoil a virgin, but he would definitely enjoy a duchess. That kind of thing is very much Conan at its core. And it's what separates Howard's version of fantasy, that hard-boiled aspect, that realism, and that bit of grit, from the more elevated, moralistic, fanciful fantasy that was more characteristic of the British writers, like E.R. Edison and J.R.R. Tolkien, who would come out with The Hobbit in 1937. But are we there yet?
We're there. I can't find the picture, but he's standing. He has a picture taken with a man named Roman Mize, who is the descendant of one of the people who was involved in the Lincoln County War. And he ran a bar across the street from the Lincoln County Courthouse, which was the old Murphy Dolan store during the Lincoln County War. This was also became the county courthouse, and this was the place where once Billy the Kid was captured by Pat Garrett after he was tried and convicted of the murder of Sheriff Brady there in Lincoln, where they were holding him before they were going to execute him. And that's where he made his famous escape, where he had 2 deputies watching him, J.D. Bell and Bob Olinger. And Bob Olinger took a bunch of the prisoners that they had across the street to the Wortley Hotel to feed them their lunch. So while that was happening, Billy had J.D. Bell take him out to the outhouse out in back of the courthouse. And somehow it's very garbled on what happened next, but as they came back into the courthouse, Billy was either able to slip off his handcuffs or he was able to turn around and fight J.D. Bell, and he got a hold of the gun. And as Bell was running down the stairs to get it and escape and get away, he shot him in the back. And there's also a bullet hole at the bottom of the steps that everybody says was from one of the bullets that he shot at J.D. Bell, either the one that killed him that passed through his body. And so a lot of Billy the Kid historians, there's a question as to whether, well, was that the actual bullet hole? Was it there, or has it been there all this time since it occurred, or is this something that they created for tourists? And they use Bob Howard's letter to H.P. Lovecraft where he's explaining the trip, and he talks about seeing the hole to say, okay, we know it was there as of June 1935. So he's become famous among Billy the Kid historians for that. But after they finished touring Lincoln, they continued on the way to Santa Fe. And when they made it to Santa Fe, one of the things they wanted to do was go see the Spanish governor's palace. And at the Spanish governor's palace, this is a picture of one of the rooms they had there showing the exhibits they had in 1924. It's copyrighted by the New Mexico Historical Association. So if you want to use it for anything, you got to get their permission. I had to pay a fee for it. But the important thing to learn about this is that you see this model of this pueblo. And one of the things that happened after this trip to New Mexico is Bob Howard was so excited by seeing Lincoln and seeing what was going on, what was on exhibit at the Spanish governor's palace, that he came back and wrote Red Nails, the last Conan tale, which is about a big city called Zuccotti, a giant circular city that's all enclosed exactly like a pueblo. And it's covered by a stone wall on the outside. And seeing some of the photographs, you can barely see, but these are photographs on the top of the wall are the various other ancient pueblos in New Mexico. So my surmise is that he saw the photograph for the Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, which is a semicircular pueblo. And there's also another picture of a pueblo, which I can't remember the name of. I think it's Tuoni or something like that, which is a circular pueblo that they had been excavating. So this fired up his imagination for the city of Zuccotti. And one of the things he writes in the letter to Lovecraft, he said, I'm not really interested in the Pueblo culture. I'm more interested in the people that came and conquered them, the Navajo, the Apache, and the Comanche. And as you see in the story, he used that because the people who built the city of Zuccotti were invaded and wiped out by the Tlaxcalans. Yeah, that were the people that Conan and Valeria dealt with when they actually made it into the city of Zuccotti. So he's following that. Their trip to New Mexico, as I said, Bob was expecting to go on for several days. It only lasted for 5 days. He writes in the letter to Lovecraft that Truett, for some reason, decided, nah, I want to go back home. I want to go back home. So they turned around. Well, actually, Bob wanted to go see some cliff dwellings, so they tried to go north and made it only as far as the Pueblo San Ildefonso, and they couldn't get any of the Navajo to tell them proper directions to get to the cliff dwellings, so they turned around and drove back, came back, went to El Paso, went drinking in El Paso, and then went on home, and he dropped Truett off in Brownwood and came back home. And he wrote Red Nails probably, that would have been about June 25th when they got back. We have in a letter and also in Otis Klein's records that, I'm sorry, I take that back, not Otis Klein's records, but we have in a letter to Lovecraft that Howard said that he had sent the letter, or the Red Nails in about the end of July to Farnsworth Wright, where Farnsworth went on ahead and accepted it to be published sometime later, and it was later published in 1936, starting the month that Bob killed himself. So, you have anything?
Talk about the price visit?
Huh?
Price visit?
Yeah, we could do that. And
Uh,
the letter, yeah.
Okay, so 18 October 1935, there was a college football game in Brownwood. The Howard Payne Yellow Jackets were fighting the Austin College Kangaroos, and it was a scoreless tie. Neither of them managed to do anything. And, Bob's driving home after this pitiful excuse for a football game, and he finds in the front parlor E. Hoffman Price. And he and his wife, Wanda, had driven up from Mexico. This was the second of their 2 trips to visit Robert E. Howard. And they stayed only a couple of days, but most of that was spent talking, according to Price. And it really has to be emphasized that we all know what it is like now to do the pilgrimage to Cross Plains, to come here out of the way from wherever we've come from. Imagine what it was like in 1935. You're driving on unimproved roads, barely above dirt and gravel, in a car with no shocks, no power steering, no regular string of gas stations, and he's got his 1932 Hudson Terraplane, white knuckle, from Mexico, and he's already patched the gas tank with chewing gum once. All right? And he shows up on Howard's doorstep, and they just go at it. And it was really at this point where Price starts telling Howard about his success splashing the spices. And Howard writes to Lovecraft later that year, "In my efforts to make new markets, I've been splashing the field, as Price calls it. One market I tried was Spicy Adventure, a sex magazine to which Ed is the star contributor." Well, Price wasn't the star contributor, and Spicy Adventure wasn't a sex magazine, but it wanted you to think it was. It was Spicy Adventures were all about selling the sizzle, not the steak. There wouldn't be any nude. There wouldn't be a description of a nude, at least not right away. A lot of the action would trail off into asterisks or periods. It would never get explicit. It would never get raunchy. But, Bob Howard found this was a market he could write to. And Otis Albert Klein actually wrote to Bob, if I can find the damn quote. "Your story, The Girl on the Hell Ship, seems to be pretty close to what Frank Armour wants for Spicy Adventures, although it may not be quite hot enough for that book. However, I am trying it on Armour and will let you know his reaction. Price has done quite well writing for this magazine as well as Spicy Detective. Perhaps he could give you some good tips on that sort of thing if you are interested in following up. Armour paid Price 1 cent a word for these yarns on acceptance." And Howard did these stories not under his own name. He had them published as Sam Walser. And Klein wrote about that, "No, I don't think anyone has any prejudice against your name. However, I do think it wise for you to use a pen name on sexy adventure stories since you are identified with the straight adventure and western field under your own name." And that's really important when you think about Bob's reputation here in Cross Plains. They knew him as a writer, and they knew him as a writer for the pulp magazines. And pulps did not have a high reputation. When Bob comes rushing into the boarding house to show Novelin Price an issue of Weird Tales with a semi-naked woman on it grasping a snake, that was slightly scandalous in the 1930s, rural Texas. And there were slightly. And there were still people when this whole get-together started up that thought of Robert E. Howard as almost a pornographer, because they hadn't read the stories, they just knew the reputation. If they'd known he'd actually written for the Spicy Pulps, he wouldn't be able to show his face in town.
Of course, if you've ever read them, they're not very spicy.
He gets a little kinky. Robert E. Howard had a modest collection of flagellation literature, because in that day there was censorship of the males. You could not get legally real pornography. However, flagellation literature fell under psychology, history, interest in judicial punishment. So, there were these logistical ways that these little publishers could get around doing something that wasn't quite porn, but was very porn adjacent. And he puts a lot of that flagellation into some of his stories because that's sold. When you look at the Blackstone, that was 1932, there's a big flagellation scene. And part of that reason was that Farnsworth Wright knew he couldn't get away with a straight nude on the cover. But if he was illustrating a scene where a girl was stripped and whipped, he could put that on the cover and it would sell. So Seabury Queen did a lot of it, Robert E. Howard did a lot of it. It was all to sell the stories more than his personal interest, probably.
It worked.
Yeah, it worked.
Staying on E. Hoffman Price and backtracking it to fantasy, weird tales, and Conan. If you can believe what E. Hoffman Price wrote about his time with Robert E. Howard, he said, he told me that he was getting plumb fed up with Conan. When Howard wrote Red Nails, he also wrote a later letter to H.P. Lovecraft, and he said about Conan, the last yarn I sold to Weird Tales, Red Nails, and it well may be the last fantasy I'll ever write, was a 3-part Conan serial, which was the bloodiest and most sexy weird story I ever wrote. Back about July 8th, Novelin reproduces a letter that Howard wrote to her talking about this, and said, indeed, days of leisure are as rare and unusual as candid friends. My time is divided between trying to make new markets to replace defaulting old ones and trying to persuade old ones to pay me what they owe me. Concerning these, my popularity in some quarters seems to be falling off, and I suppose the editors feel they can do without me, forgetting that this has happened repeatedly in the past and that I've always built myself up again with the readers. But this time I don't think I'll go to the trouble of a rebuild. I'll devote my time into breaking into new pastures. I'm neither smart nor subtle, but I have sense enough to know when I'm being played for a sucker. So you can pretty much say that is how he feels about Weird Tales and Farnsworth Wright. And it looks like Red Nails was probably going to be the last Conan story he ever wrote, as I would say that he was probably at that point done with it.
Yeah, there is one note in Novelin's book where she writes, Bob said he had an idea for a Conan yard that was about to gel, hadn't got to the place where he was ready to write it. All he'd done so far was make a few notes. And that might have been Wolves Beyond the Border. We don't know, but it is about the right time frame. But yeah, it definitely looks like he was moving on to better paying markets.
So you get into November, and now he's writing, for a lot of the pulps, including the Spicies. He also picks up starting to write for some of the Weird Menace pulps. If you've seen the Foundation book, the Weird Menace, got the mummy on the cover. Mark Wheatley's great artwork on that one. So some of those stories he was starting to write at that point. But also in November, his mother turns south again and needs to go to Marlin. She had been gone to Marlin for the water treatments that were supposedly helping her. But this time it wasn't working very well. She wasn't really responding like she used to. Meanwhile, Howard's staying there with her. I mean, he's got to drive her out there. She stays there. He would stay at a little house right across the street from it. They would rent it. He would rent it. And then he would continue working on some of these stories while he's there. Then they had to leave. And so, so he's faced with, he's got his responsibilities to his mother to take care of her. And again, unlike Novelin thought, well, her husband's a doctor, he can take care of her. But the problem is Dr. Howard was on call to all of the people in, Cross Plains and the entire area. So he didn't have time to be able to, care for her. So it fell on Howard. And so he's under a lot of stress at this point, trying to take care of his mother, but at the same time, he's also trying to write for the pulps. And so it's getting more and more difficult toward the end of the year here.
If I can back up real quick. On August 18th, Howard finishes and sends in to Otis Klein his fix-up novel of the first 8 or so stories of Breckenridge Elkins with filler material from Bear Creek. Klein sends it out to American publishers to see if any of them want to buy it and publish it. And by October, they hadn't heard anything from the publishers they had sent it to, So Klein suggested, let's try England, let's send it to the United Kingdom, because Klein had been starting to send some of Howard's stories to the United Kingdom to see if they would buy any of them for publishing over there.
And this was Klein's specialty as an agent, was he had what he called the overseas sales plan, because you could sell stuff to the American market, first North American serial rights only, and then you could also sell rights to foreign markets like Canada and the United Kingdom and farther afield to Scandinavia. And all of these rights cost, it was less money coming in, but it was more than you were getting just selling to one market. And Klein kept that up right until World War II, when everything fell to hell.
Going back to November, so you heard from Will how things were getting tough for Howard financially. If you remember at the start of it, we read the excerpt from the letter to August Derleth, where he said he was going to stop writing detective stories because he couldn't get the hang of it. November 15th, he receives a letter from Rogers Terrell, who's the editor of several pulps for popular publications, on a weird menace story that he had sent them for publication. I wish I could talk. Says, "Dear Mr. Howard, although your story, The Devils of Dark," and he wrote the name wrong, he says Dark Lane, it's Dark Lake, is too much of the adventure type for us. I wish you'd study our needs a bit more carefully. This is the important part. You can write exceptionally well, and I'm sure you can do our kind of story. Will you try us with something else? Sincerely, Roger Terrell, editor, Western magazines and mystery magazines. So he was still sending his mysteries in and able to write them. And let's see. We have a letter on November to August Derleth where he says, "I'm seriously contemplating devoting all my time and efforts to Western writing, abandoning all other forms of work entirely. The older I get, the more my thoughts and interests are drawn back over the trails of the past. So much has been written, but there is so much that should be written." This was because he was really starting to break out in the Western fields with his humorous Westerns and his straight Westerns.
And Lovecraft and Derleth had been working on Howard to try to get him to write more of the Western and Southwestern fiction. And that's where we get the Southwestern Gothic horrors like Pigeons from Hell and Black Canaan. Sorry to interrupt.
No, keep going.
Okay.
Take it now.
So while Derleth and Lovecraft recognized the popularity of the Conan stories, they also thought they were pretty much potboilers for the most part. They thought Howard had better stuff in him because they had read his letters. They had read when Howard would wax eloquent about the Southwest and the history and the personalities there, and they wanted to see more of that. And Derleth himself was already leaning into being a regional writer with the Sac Prairie saga. And Lovecraft thought that Howard could do the same. Now, whether or not that would be any money, we don't know. But it definitely seems that this encouragement did have an effect on Howard. We often talk about how much Lovecraft influenced Howard, but it's not so much the pastiches, it's the encouragement. Lovecraft wanted Howard to be more Howard. He wanted him to continue to write more of the fiction that only he could write. And when people would write to Lovecraft about Robert E. Howard, and he would talk back to him, he would give them his impression of Howard that he got from his letters. And I'm just going to read a part of one here. "He was very bitter and cynical in temperament, but kindly and sympathetic at the same time, extremely brave and conscientious. At one time during his teens, he worked at a drugstore soda fountain. He has seen a good deal of the rough life of oil boom towns and hotly resents the way large Eastern corporations exploit Texas. When he says his life is tame and uneventful, he is thinking only of Western standards. Actually, he sees a vast amount of violence. He sympathizes greatly with outlaws, is really a fanatic on the subject of alleged police prosecutions, unjust arrests, third degree, etc. His fetishes are strength, civility, justice, and freedom. Everything civilized, soft, effeminate, or orderly he hates with astonishing venom. In ancient history, he detests Rome as strongly as I revere it. He travels occasionally in Texas and the Southwest, has seen the Carlsbad Caverns, and sometimes spends the winter in San Antonio. Has never been east of New Orleans. First stories published in Weird Tales in 1925 or 6. A poet of savagely great power. And this was the image of Robert E. Howard in 1935. If you were a fan of the pulps, if you were reading the fanzines, if you were picking up the magazines and you were reading the letters in Weird Tales, this is the image of Howard you would receive. He was this guy in Texas that was very much a character in his own right. He was a personality. But what they did not see was the man beneath. The guy that was breaking his health, trying to write, trying to support his parents, with a failing relationship with Novelyn Price, and just trying to keep it going as far as he could, even as things looked bleaker and bleaker. Economically, this 1935 was not his best year. He only cleared about $700 through the client agency and a little more through Weird Tales. We don't know exactly how much because we don't have the stubs, but you know, he earned less in 1935 than he did in 1934. But he had written a great deal, he'd sold a great deal, and a great deal would be published in 1936. So he was looking forward to more money coming in, but it was that crunch. It was that tight spot right there as he was ending the year and going into the next one.
Good place to end.
On December 27th.
Maybe it's not.
Wait, there's more.
That's why I was.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
He replied to a letter he received from an agent, August Leninger, who also was an agent for REH Price. Price also used Otis Klein. He said, "I have received your letter of the 17th and read it with much interest, together with the literature that accompanied it. Mr. Otis Adelbert Klein handles most of my work, and I have no reason to be dissatisfied with him. However, there's no harm in having more than one string to a bow. As in the case of my friend Ed Price, who does business with both yourself and Mr. Klein, and seems to be doing very well indeed. I noticed that in your ad in the December issue of the A&G, author and journalist, you state that in the case of a professional who has sold $1,000 worth of stuff within the last year, you will waive reading fees and handle his work on straight commission. Well, I sold considerably more than $1,000 worth of stories. If you are willing to handle my work on a straight commission basis, I'll be glad to send you some yarns and let you see what you can do with them. Of your ability as an agent, there is, of course, no question. As to my yarns, I write westerns, adventure, fantasy, sport, and occasionally detective. I have been a contributor to Weird Tales for 11 years, and the 70,000-word novel, The Hour of the Dragon, is at present running in that magazine as a serial. Action Stories is running a series of humorous Western shorts, one of these stories having appeared in every issue of the magazine for about 2 years now. In the past few months, I have made 3 new markets: Western Aces, Thrilling Mystery, and Spicy Adventures. In addition to the magazines above mentioned, my work has appeared in Ghost Stories, Argosy, Fight Stories, Oriental Stories, Sports Stories, Thrilling Adventures, Texaco Star, The Ring, Strange Detectives, Super Detectives, Strange Tales, Frontier Times, and Jack Dempsey's Fight magazine. So you can see that he was definitely still working hard on what he was wanting to do and making a living.
Okay. The very last line I want to give you, this is from E. Hoffman Price in his memoir. The last time I saw him, mid-October 1935, he was the most impressive of my writer associates. Often and often, I wished and I hoped that I someday might reach his level. And that was Robert E. Howard in 1935. Thank you all.